And welcome to our program, North of Dixie, Civil Rights Photography Beyond the South. I'm David McCartney. I'm the University Archivist at the University of Iowa. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker this evening. The history of the civil rights movement is commonly illustrated with well-known photographs from Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, leaving the visual story of the movement outside the South remaining to be told. In North of Dixie, historian Mark Speltz shines a light past the most iconic photographs of the era to focus on images of everyday activists who fought campaigns against segregation, police brutality, and job discrimination in cities like Philadelphia, Cleveland, Columbus, St. Louis, Cedar Rapids, and many other cities in the North. Mark is an author and historian who writes about civil rights photography, vernacular architecture, and Wisconsin culture and history. He is currently a senior historian at American Girl in Madison. This evening's event is made possible by the Iowa City Public Library, the Department of Special Collections and University Archives at the University of Iowa Libraries, excuse me, and the Historical Iowa Civil Rights Network, or HICORN, as we in Iowa like to call it. We have to get corn into our acronym somehow. HICORN is an association of archivists, librarians, historians, former civil rights workers, and others who gather and preserve the stories of Iowans who have been active in the civil rights movement, both at home and elsewhere. Participating institutions of HICORN include the State Historical Society of Iowa, the University of Iowa, Grinnell College, Iowa State University, Drake University, St. Ambrose University, and the Sioux City Public Museum. You can like HICORN on Facebook by searching Historical Iowa Civil Rights Network. Mark's talk this evening promises to be very informative and engaging, and afterward there will be an opportunity for you to ask Mark any questions or bring up any points that you might enjoy in participating in a discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Iowa City, Mark Speltz.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here tonight. It's nice to not be competing against the Cubs. Last night I was in St. Louis, and it was a smaller and an intimate crowd. But I think the Cubs winning is good for humanity in some way. It's good for all of us. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm deeply grateful to David for helping organize the event, Maeve, Beth, and Bond, and to Prairie Lights for having books available for everybody tonight. I'm incredibly excited to finally be sharing this book. It's been about 9 to 10 years in the making. The last 3 to 4 is when I've really devoted the most time to it. But I'm not going to show you every photograph in the book. I'm not going to tell you every theme or story, because the point of a good book talk is to pique your interest. So you'll want to pick it up, turn the pages, and linger over the photographs and the stories that are in it. I want you to be able to tell your friends about the book or think about civil rights photography just a little bit differently. So I'm going to share some of my favorite images, talk a little bit about its development and a few core themes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and then the book signing will be out in the hall. And I should add, when we do questions, they'll have a microphone that they'll bring to you, because this is being recorded so it can be shared with people who couldn't be here tonight. I've been deeply interested in civil rights photography for about a decade, and it all started with these 2 photographs on the screen. Back in 2007, I was in a UWM photography and visual culture class, and we were supposed to select a photograph and write about it, read it, interpret it, figure out what the story was. used it as a source. And I knew immediately I wanted to look at civil rights photography. I'd always been moved by them. I always found them very powerful. So I went to the Wisconsin Historical Society, which has a very strong social justice collection, and began digging through it. And I would hold pictures in my hand from Little Rock, Arkansas, Daisy Bates' collection. I looked at photographs, snapshots that people took at Freedom Summer in 1964 and would bring home and show their family. So literally snapshots that have never been published or seen outside of that building. And then I held the picture on the left in my hand from Jackson, Mississippi. The three people sitting at the lunch counter hoping for service, knowing they wouldn't get it and needing to endure whatever came. Is anybody familiar with the photo? Raise your hands if you've seen it. All right. It's incredibly iconic. It's in many history books. It's in documentaries. It's the type of photograph that we see time and time again when we hear the words civil rights movement. It involves intimidation, violence, the threat of violence, nonviolence versus teens, police, those types of scenes. Now, the photo on the right I had never seen before, taken in Milwaukee, 1967, on the second night of an open housing march into a white neighborhood. The interracial group, the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council, decided they were going to take on housing segregation in Milwaukee, and they were going to march to the south side, which was predominantly white at the time, to make a point. And when they got there, they encountered thousands of whites along the sidewalks throwing rocks, bottles, bags of urine, and they needed police protection. So the officer, looking straight into the camera, has got his rifle out, and that gives you a feel for the intensity of the scene that night. I didn't know what to make of that photo. I'd never seen anything like it. So my advisor, who was working on the 40th anniversary of those open housing marches, said, why don't you explore that angle? It's new. You know, nobody's really written about the movement so much in the North from the photographic perspective. And that's what I chose to do, and that's how it all started. So I dug really deep into the Milwaukee story, 2007, 2009, 2012, as I did conference papers and articles for magazines. And I went through every journal and Sentinel newspaper on microfilm till my eyes were, bleeding over, dull. Looking at the photographs, looking at the captions, seeing how they used them, where they appeared in the paper, what stories did they tell. And then I went to the newspaper archive, the morgue, and held the prints in my hands that ran in the paper. I flipped them over and read the captions and wrote down the names of the photographers and when they were taken. And there were this many file folders worth of photos, which is a lot of photos when you think how thin they are. So a lot of them, the overwhelming majority, didn't run. So I began to look at, well, what stories didn't run, what photographs weren't used, what did they prefer to use. And then I began talking to those photographers whose names I wrote down. And you can see somebody on the top left photograph, on the far right of it, wearing a helmet. They were protecting themselves. They were doing their job. It was incredibly dangerous. And they would talk about being the low guys on the totem pole. You know, the youngest photographers were working nights and weekends when the marches were. So they were documenting. Then I talked to the black press photographers who grew up in Milwaukee and learned photography and how to develop film in the high schools, and then began working for the black press and covered it from a different angle. And then I tracked down people who worked for the likes of Jet Magazine and Ebony, who came out of Chicago to shoot what was going on. Ebony covered this, one of the marches, and in their November issue printed about 17 photographs. Ebony had a subscriber, the number of subscribers was 1 million. So a lot of people saw these Milwaukee open housing struggles, yet nobody really knows much about them outside of Milwaukee. So then when I turned back to the secondary literature about photography and civil rights movement, there was very little about the North and the West of photography. And I thought, well, where are all these northern photographs? What does civil rights look like in the North and beyond Dixie? And when I went to those books, these are the ones that I found, which makes a lot of sense. When you say the word civil rights movement, these are the types of images that pop into your head, or something very similar. And because they were so iconic, I wanted to begin to understand, how did they become iconic? What do they capture? What do they show? What's the story behind the moment, the historic moment, like in Little Rock or at the March on Washington or the Selma March on the far right? And they're truly remarkable, and you begin to see them all over. The one on the bottom left, I've seen in textbooks, saw it in Life magazine, not in 1963 because I wasn't alive, but I've seen it so much I wanted to understand how it happened. And the story behind it is Dr. King and the SCLC, who were in Birmingham, understood that if they could get the city to overreact, visually react in a dramatic fashion, the international press, the national press would cover it to that degree. And so when Bull Connor overreacted and called out police dogs, they ended up on the front pages of the New York Times, Washington Post, even in Russian newspapers. And then the fire hoses, which could knock people over or shoot the bark off of trees or wash people down the sidewalk, attracted international attention. And those photographs helped pave the way for civil rights legislation. You know, overall, the civil rights photography made presidents sick. It moved politicians. It changed the conscience of the nation. All different types of photographs impacted different communities. But it's clear when we just look at a handful of iconic images, we're only seeing part of the story, and we're not seeing the North or the West. We often see a very Southern story, a very violent story. We see a lot of brutalized black bodies and people being attacked with hoses and dogs. We see charismatic male leaders as the voice of the movement. We don't see ordinary Americans protesting. So I came to understand what was being left out and that there was a need for a book like North of Dixie. So North of Dixie is just my small effort to recast that visual narrative. It's a visual exploration of the movement beyond the most iconic individuals, locations, and the best known images. The goal of the book is to make visible lesser known but equally inspiring stories from LA to Iowa to Harlem, from coast to coast. It's filled with 100 photographs taken from the early 30s to the late 70s, and it shows the breadth of the movement and the diversity of the issues that activists took on. So everyone always asks, where did you find all the photographs? On the internet? And that's partly true, but that was only a means to get to the people who took them, to the archives and the archivists who protect them, who share them, the museums who display them, to the books that told me about places like Philadelphia, Seattle, St. Louis, Iowa, where other struggles happened and what kind of photos were out there. And as I expanded my reach and connected with different people at different locations, then I began to travel, and I went to the Library of Congress, spent 3 days there going through the NAACP photo collections. The top left one you see, I put that in there for last night, my talk in St. Louis. You can see what issues were important in St. Louis in 1942. They wanted to stop lynching. They talked about the double V, the victory at home during the war and the victory abroad, and that they were all Americans. While I was at the Library of Congress, I also went through Look magazine's photograph collections, kind of like everybody knows that, like Life, big color mag. They have all the prints and all the old prints that didn't run. U.S. News and World Report is there, and a bunch of newspapers. Went to the Chicago History Museum. I also worked with the Schomburg, and then I went out to the Getty in L.A., who ended up being the publisher of the book, and learned about the Charles Britton collection down on the bottom left. And this was a photographer who worked for CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and they have all of his prints, his negatives, and his contact sheets. So I was able to look at where he would circle his favorite photographs or crop or shade things out, and you got to begin to understand, I didn't get to just see one photograph, got to see hundreds of them, and really got to understand how he worked and what he used and why. So in the end, I ended up working with other photographers who were still living, like Bob Edelman and Bob Fitch, both of which who have passed away in the last year. Gordon Parks, the first African-American photographer for Life magazine. I worked with his foundation and looked at hundreds of unpublished works from his most famous Life mag shoots, and then picked 2 that got to be in the book. Ultimately, I had 50 different photographers in the book. So out of 100 photographs, 50 different photographers. And then I went for a nice geographic distribution. I used about 25 different cities. So by now you're probably wondering, well, how do photographs from the North differ from those in the South? And I worked really hard throughout this book process to figure out that question. And when I came to the end, there really wasn't a difference. I know that sounds funny, but there wasn't a difference in type of photographs. There was no shortage of dramatic confrontations in the North, no shortage of racist actions, no shortage of inspiring speeches or moments or marches. When the Northern media preferred to bury the story or not cover it at all. They would cast photos aside for more nonviolent, heroic Southern moments. The photo on the left was taken by a woman named Joan Liefring Zug Beret, if I pronounced that properly. She's sitting here with us today. She was active in the NAACP, and when Dr. King came to Cedar Rapids to speak at Coe College, the Cedar Rapids Gazette didn't cover it. He was really well known by that time, would win the Nobel Prize at the end of the next year, but they didn't cover the issue. Would you like to add in?
They covered for his visit to Cornell and Mount Vernon about 3 inches of type.
Sure.
And did not cover it in Cedar Rapids.
Okay.
That color.
And I'm grateful to Mary Bennett for tipping me off to Joan's work and that photograph. When the Northern media decided to cover photographs and stories of local activism, and it couldn't be ignored anymore because it was garnering so much attention, they had the same insatiable appetite for active, dramatic, violent, eye-grabbing scenes, images that were drawing readers' attention. Yet when they ran in the press and when they covered it, whether it was on the front page or the opinion page, the issues were not covered with the same moral clarity and conviction that they used to cover the South. The Southern stories were easier to frame, easier to blame the South rather than to cover the story and really understand it in your own community. It was just easier to shift the focus. So seeing Northern photos of endless marches, burning crosses in Detroit, or kids waving flags, Confederate flags, on the streets of Chicago, complicate how we understand the civil rights movement. The North was not as racially benevolent as we like to think it was. It wasn't the Northern Promised Land. Northern activism is all but absent in the way that we characterize, teach, and remember the era. We can't see only half the story if we're going to understand the most important and defining social movement of modern American history. Dr. King often reminded people that America's racial issue was not a sectional, but a national problem. Racism and discrimination in the North were often more hidden. There weren't signs for separate drinking fountains or segregated beaches. Photographers had to work a lot harder to make these issues visible, and activists understood that as well. You had to march into a Chicago neighborhood to call attention to the issue. Or, like on the far right, you had to lay down under a steam shovel to stop construction of schools that furthered a segregated school system in Cleveland. People struggled against pervasive forms of discrimination and housing segregation, redlining, racial steering, or neighborhood boundaries that were protected often by force. And those housing patterns led to school segregation and unequal schools. There are also inadequate city services like garbage collection, job discrimination, even during wartime booms like the St. Louis photo from 1942. There were 3,000 people employed at Carter Carburetor, but not a single black. So they were benefiting from the wartime boom, but not hiring people who needed work in their own city. These issues are difficult to separate and difficult to legislate away with legislation. They're also interconnected. And the photographs, when we look at a diversity of issues across the whole nation, we understand just how complex the movement was. So it's important to stress that as we look at a broader struggle waged nationwide, it not only helps us see the actions of individuals, it helps us realize just how broad the racial issue was. It was never just a Southern issue like we liked to say. The benefits of looking beyond the most iconic and well-known stories is we're able to better identify and appreciate lesser-known grassroots movements that were conceived of, built by, and waged by ordinary everyday Americans. We see a woman in Brooklyn kneeling on her protest sign. She's blocking a dump truck at a construction site at a hospital that wouldn't hire African American workers. So they were slowing the construction process. We see activism and we see agency, people working for change, not waiting for it to come to them. We see men and women in 1955, San Francisco. The women are in white gloves holding their picket signs. They're protesting the yellow cab company outside of a Tony Hotel there in San Fran that wouldn't hire a single black driver. We see people making change. They're not waiting for Dr. King to show up to their community to lead. They're leading it themselves. They were not going to take no for an answer, and they were challenging America to be better. Many popular accounts of the civil rights movement begin to talk about the story in the North when Dr. King came to Chicago in 65, 66 to rid the city of slums. The story continues in those books that the movement floundered up in the North. There's black power, riots, rebellions, and it ended just like that, all in the period of a couple of years. But a whole generation of scholars have shown and unearthed all these different stories, and the photographs in the book help document that the roots of the campaigns nationwide reached 20, 30 years back, sometimes to World War II. The picture on the top right shows a protest in Chicago outside of a roller skating rink. It was in a black neighborhood. They didn't allow blacks inside. The roller skating rink was called White City Roller Skating Rink. And CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was formed in Chicago in the early 40s. Well, they took on the issue in about 1944, 1945, and they began picketing, and they weren't getting much change. They weren't making a difference. And they innovated by deciding to try a stand-in where they would block the ticket booth on the busiest night of the week, which was Saturday, so nobody could get in. Suddenly, the management were a little more worried about it, and they began to talk a little bit more, but then the police would come and beat them up. There were arrests. More people came and joined the struggle, including veterans. You can see the guy in the middle holding the sign that says the draft board did not exclude Negroes. So by showing up in his uniform, he's demonstrating that he not only that he fought for democracy abroad and helped win the World War II, but he came home to a second-class citizenship. So it's a very powerful way to protest. CORE was the same group that held sit-ins in 1942 in Chicago at the Jack Spratt Coffee House. So the movement was alive and well decades before most people believed that Dr. King brought nonviolence and brought the struggle north. The picture on the left is one that I like because it shows how organizations used photography to make issues that were not open, visible to the public eye. They used cameras and pictures to make them visible. In this particular case, an NAACP official in the black jacket with the armband is with a janitor or a resident who's pointing to the ceiling with his broom. And he's pointing to where a huge piece of plaster fell. You know, there was water damage and moisture, and the plaster crashed to the floor. Pictures like this appeared in the New York newspapers, and really actually probably in Pittsburgh and Detroit and any African-American neighborhood for decades. And you would see somebody laying in bed with a big white bandage. You'd see people who had been injured by plaster falling. You'd see them standing in their kitchen next to a hole in the wall where rats as big as cats would come in, or leaky pipes or bad wiring that would start fires. And the issue was negligent landlords who could charge blacks who couldn't move into a better neighborhood. They could charge them a lot for substandard housing, dangerous housing. So this helped expose these types of things. This was a daily civil rights issue. Daily health depended upon it. But when you begin to assemble this collection of photographs that demonstrate the number of issues that people were protesting against for decades before the mid-60s, they challenge some of the assumptions that we have about that time period, not only about when the movement started, but about riots and rebellions. They didn't explode on their own. There were a lot of issues that led to them, and we often forget about that. So there are protests against segregation, unsafe housing, unequal schools, overzealous policing. And when we see those protests and those photos, urban unrest, which is incredibly violent and damaging, looks more like a reaction or a protest to inaction, complacency, and silence. So seeing more photos sometimes makes us think about the issues in a different way. They look different. One of the earliest and best-known activist photographers during the movement was Lyon. And he was a college kid from the University of Chicago, and he headed south to take pictures with his camera with SNCC. And the first protest he went to was in Cairo, Illinois in 1962, where he took that picture. Congressman John Lewis is on the left, kneeling. And Danny took a lot of pictures, but one of the things that I like about this one, not only that it was taken in Illinois, it was used as a poster. And they sold them for $1 a piece. And they printed 10,000 of that. So it brought in badly needed money for civil rights organizations. So they innovated in that way. They were one of the most media savvy and photographic friendly organizations out during the civil rights movement. SNCC's work inspired me to look at what other groups did, not only SNCC, but other groups in the North and the West. And I came across this guy named Bruce Hartford, who took that picture, that grainy little fuzzy photo on the left. And I talked to him for a little while, and he worked with a group called NVAC, which was the Nonviolent Action Committee, and they were in Los Angeles. And they would do these sort of guerrilla tactics, which were designed to just create chaos and call attention to the local issues. And in this particular one, it's a really active shot. They were protesting hiring discrimination at the Van de Kamp Bakery Product Company. So they put on big placards that said, "Don't buy Van de Kamp's bakery products." They marched into the grocery store singing freedom songs and throwing, leaflets all around about the issue so people would be educated on it. And then they'd take all the bakery products off the shelf, fill up the grocery carts, and go up to the shopping line and then leave. So they would just create chaos, essentially. The cops and the grocery stores caught on to them after about 10 of them, and they had to change their tactics. But the photograph I liked, it had never been seen before or published or exhibited. And I liked it because he told me that he had a little brownie camera. He didn't have a good camera. He got something 20 years earlier, and he was still using it in the 60s. And he was just an amateur, but he knew from watching other organizations that photographs added impact to their leaflets. The one on the right, is another photograph he took on a little leaflet. That one was a sip-in. They would go in and sip coffee or something at a cafe. But he knew that it added impact and it would promote their cause. Very low budget, but effective. The next photo that I want to talk about is the top right, a very powerful photograph from Detroit. taken by a representative for the NAACP there. Detroit had the largest NAACP branch in the whole nation. And they came up against hiring discrimination, school segregation, racist textbooks, and police brutality. And between 1956 and 1960, they investigated 150 different allegations that were brought to them or people came to visit. And they took photographs, they wrote down the story, wrote up an affidavit and a press release and sent photographs to the black press and the white press. And only the black press would run the photos. The white press never would. But they used these photographs, which are now in the archives at Wayne State, as a way to call attention to this issue that was rarely seen. 1/3 of those 150 allegations happened behind closed doors at the precinct offices. So nobody would know about it unless they publicized it. The 4th chapter of the book is about surveillance and the idea of the camera being so powerful of a weapon to expose racism, expose poor conditions and whatnot, to move the American people. The idea that the camera was then also turned around and used against the movement. So surveillance is an issue that's not really talked about much in the civil rights movement, but lining the sidewalks are police officers, like on the far right, taking photographs, documenting who's at a march, how many people are there, what do they look like, who's in the crowd that we know. So the camera was a weapon. In that case, it's very overt. You can see his uniform. And if you were in a city somewhere and you had maybe been arrested and you had a police record and you saw a police officer taking pictures or writing down names, you'd think twice about maybe acting out or coming again. It was a form of intimidation along with surveillance. The top left photograph was taken in Seattle at an open housing demonstration. I had seen the photograph online and I thought it was, you know, a neat photograph, and I had researched it a little bit. And when I went to the online archive at the Seattle Municipal Archives, I looked through about 25 photos and I began to notice a pattern where people would, you know, go like this and block their face or cover it. And then there was one of this little kid that I've always loved just sticking his tongue out right at the photographer. And I thought, they didn't like the photographer. And sure enough, when we were able to get to the bottom of it, there was a memo that said, Sergeant Noble took these photographs on this day. These were the signs we saw. These are the people that we knew at the protest. And they documented. They were doing surveillance and documenting it. And they sent that to the mayor. So it was a pretty big issue at the time. Some people were a lot more secretive about it. The Chicago police had a red squad that was basically top secret. Those photographs were part of a lawsuit, and now they're available to the public after you sign a bunch of legal forms to even look at them. You can go through, and you can go by name, you can go by organization. They built massive photographic archives. One of the ones that I use in the book has a number 1 on it next to this woman's face. She's holding a sign, and it has number 1, and when you flip it over, her name's on the back. And that photo was added to a file that was amassed about her, what organization she was involved with, where she lived, you know, where she went to college, whatever the newspaper articles that mentioned her. So it was a way to collect information, and photography played a role in it. To give you a feel for the amount of photographs that were probably taken, the pictures in the middle from New York City, 1969, you can't see them, and I understand that. There were 6 rolls of film taken of this one march by one photographer. So one Black Panther rally in 1969, 6 rolls of film, gives you a feel for the amount of photography that's out there. Now, I don't think that you can point at one photograph and say that it changed or, you know, impacted the struggle in a real way. You know, surveillance is surveillance, and it's what they did with it. But I think that coupled with the actions that were taken by organizations against civil rights groups and black power groups, along with surveillance and infiltration, there's no doubt that they impacted the struggle in some way, locally or nationally. A lot of the secret operations, like the FBI's counterintelligence program were discovered in the 70s, and those types of archives. Some have been destroyed, some are available, some are still under lock and key, and you'll just never get into them. But I thought that it was an important angle that people don't write about with civil rights photography, and that's why I included it as the 4th chapter. For the last slide that I have, I talk about the present, and I write about it in the epilogue, kind of looking backwards at inspirational photos and what technology is doing today. And as you can imagine, it was a pretty powerful time to be writing a book about the civil rights movement and photography. Every tragic event that happened made the book all the more relevant and sometimes would influence what I saw in photographs. But I think that the photographs help give the historical context so people can better understand what's happening now, or at least to begin to better understand. And with each tragic police killing or college protest or racial incident, a whole new set of images filter through across our TV screens and computer screens and cell phones. And time again, we look back to the historic photographs for comparisons. The cover of the book, which you can only see small on the screen, little boy in Newark being pushed off the sidewalks by the National Guardsmen who have their bayonets exposed. This was an incredibly powerful photograph when it was taken in 1967. But it looks a lot different right now when we compare it to photographs with people's hands up. And you talk about hands up, don't shoot. That photograph suddenly resonates in a new, even more powerful way. So these gestures or hashtags or whatnot, spread from protest to protest. And that is aided by technology. They're able to amplify the issues, send out photographs or messages so much further than any civil rights group ever could have 50 years ago. So they can document clashes or slogans, inspiring moments, and then share it along a broad social network with incredible reach, much further than the news ever could have. And I was thinking about this a lot when I was writing the epilogue for the book, shortly, within 4 or 5 months of Ferguson. And I reached out to an activist who went down there who was very prolific on Twitter and taking photographs. And so he was in the streets reporting on what was happening, so he wasn't really in the media, so you got a different perspective. But he was doing it all on Twitter and different types of social media platforms. He took the far right photograph, and his name's D. Ray McKesson. And I reached out to him and said, can I use one of your photographs for my books? This is what I'm doing. And he was fine with it. And I think that he also saw the connection to the past and how it's changing now with technology. He went down with about 800 followers, or friends, if you will. And he left with about 300,000 people paying attention to what he was saying and what he was broadcasting. He's since run for the mayor of Baltimore. He now has 800,000 followers. And, a follower is a follower, whatever. But it's an incredible platform. If there's a problem in another city, he's likely to go and he's able to, broadcast that out or help them in some way. So it's an incredible way to use social media and technology. And in fact, the last thing I wanted to say before we go to questions is there's a scholar at Harvard right now named Sarah Lewis, and she's studying protest photography and whatnot. And she remarked that this overwhelming, we all feel an overwhelmed sense of technology and visual content. There's so much, and we're swimming in it. And she kind of compared it to the invention of technology, when suddenly there were so many photographs, and it was so new, and it affected people in a different way. And now you have this democratization of imagery and technology, and you can shape yourself and share the message in this way or that way, just as they were learning to do then. And she said, if you can think about how far we've come with photography and how people have used it and art has come, what can we do with technology? So I think that's a really positive way to think about it, and it really stopped me when I read that. The flip side of it, though, is will those digital pictures be around in 50 years? You know, if I drop my phone and run over it, you know, will they all be gone? I don't know that a book like this will be possible in 50 years. But there are some groups that are starting to preserve things. There's a Ferguson archive where people can send their tweets and their photographs. There's one in Baltimore. And they're starting to, you know, do the hard archival work on how to do this, figuring out how much money it costs to do it, figuring out how to convince people to send their tweets, send their photographs. You know, it's going to be just a minor percentage of the images, but it's something, and it's starting the way. So as I said, I wasn't going to show you every single photograph. There are a lot in the talk. But I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what's in the book and a glimpse of a few of the issues and the things that I found fascinating. So I'd love to welcome any questions. We've got a microphone in back, so if you can just wave your hand and be patient, then we'll take questions.
Since I have the microphone, I'm going to start. Sorry, Rachel.
So
the photographs that you've included, are they strictly photojournalists and no amateur?
That's a great question. There are a lot of variety, a lot of photojournalists, some artists who were working, activist photographers like Charles Britton and Danny Lyon and Bob Edelman, and then a few amateurs and some police officers.
So but the amateurs were collected by libraries or archives. How did you get to the amateurs?
Sometimes I worked really hard and found out about them in books. In the case of Bruce Hartford, he's involved with a civil rights movement, Volunteers Online, and I think that I looked through all the profiles that I could find of people who were active in the North. So some people had Southern experiences, and then they, you know, returned to New York or wherever, and then became active there. And so in their bio, I'd read that, and then I'd reach out to them individually. I sent, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of emails. I mean, a couple people in the room I reached out to and networked through to find stuff in Iowa. But that's how I had to get to and discover some of them.
Thank you. Rachel.
Thanks, that was great. I guess I have two questions. One, you're from Madison. Did you see the photo from Camp Randall last weekend?
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And then my other question is, when you're talking about photography as a weapon, it reminded me of the philosopher Walter Benjamin and how he talked about the mechanical reproduction of art and how that could be useful as a protest weapon. And something I've been thinking about lately is police body cameras, and how that could also be a weapon for truth and change. And I wonder if you could talk about that in the context of Walter Benjamin and using photography as a weapon. Or if you know if anyone else is talking about that, because I haven't really seen anything written about that.
Madison, I don't really have anything to say other than it's incredibly shameful and embarrassing.
Can you tell us what you're talking about?
Sure. Somebody at the Badgers game, and I don't really remember all the details, somebody at the recent Badgers game wore a Halloween costume, I believe, and it was an effigy of President Obama. And he was allowed into the arena to wear it, and, you know, it was quite a while. Yes, I'm sorry, he was being lynched with a red and white, you know, Badger rope. And he was let into the stadium, and there for a little while before people began complaining and stadium security came. And the UW police response was not really adequate either. I mean, it was, if I remember right, it was something about, you know, free speech. You know, we don't condone that, but it was free speech. And since they've come down a little bit harder, I think Barry Alvarez, who's a patron saint there, is working really hard to change things. But it was, you know, really unbelievable. I have not read about Benjamin and thought about it in connection to police cameras. I don't think that it solves everything. And, you know, we continually hear that when something happens, they weren't on or they were being turned off before something happens. So they're not a protect-all, but I think one of the things that is happening now is through technology and through easy video sharing, you know, we're seeing more, and it is changing the game.
And so are people writing about their scholars? Sorry.
Is there scholarship about that in the context of what Walter Benjamin was talking about?
I'm not aware of any. It wouldn't surprise me, though, with some really adept Googling that you could find somebody who's connecting on it. Thanks.
Do we have more questions? Mary, do you have something?
This is a little tangential, but I just got back from Standing Rock, North Dakota, and there's a lot of posting that's going out on Facebook, but actually the authorities are tracking all of that and pulling video down that they regard as negative portrayals of themselves. But there's all kinds of civil rights abuses and humanitarian crisis going on as we speak. And even though there could be 1 million viewers out there, how are they going to shape the political outcome with those photographs, which are very, very powerful?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a double-edged sword. There's a lot more access, and people can be there and then share it back because the media is not necessarily covering it much at all. A question I got last night was, how would the media have covered that in the 60s? And I have no idea, but they probably would have covered it a little bit more, you might hope. So with the access and people able to share it more and more and send it back, that's great because now we're learning about it and more people on Facebook change their location to say they were there. You know, so there's more awareness. But the flip side, again, is the actual tracking of people who are there. Any cell coverage, anything that's there and can be tracked is likely being tracked by the police and other organizations to be used against them. So there's no doubt that it's a double-edged sword. So when I talk about technology, you can march through the streets of Chicago with a group, whereas, you know, watching online, live. And it's a pretty interesting way for people to connect. But it can also be used then very much against them.
It's just interesting because Facebook claims to be a public forum and even had articles in the paper a week ago saying they weren't allowing that. But even here at Mississippi Stand down in Sandusky, Iowa on the Mississippi River, the footage of the arrest was pulled down off of Facebook. So it's happening every single day. So I guess if we're interested in free speech as it relates to civil rights, as citizens, we need to start complaining about that removing of that public forum or dishonest use of it.
Yeah.
That's just my comment.
No, I appreciate that. I had questions last night about that as well, Standing Rock.
In the era in which I was a photographer and a stringer for the Des Moines Register, for example, as you noted in your book, the Cedar Rapids Gazette did not cover black issues. The Des Moines Register, thanks to Gardner Coles, one of the owners, had a policy that the Register would work in Iowa to promote civil rights, and they did. And in a sense, it forced the other newspapers to start covering the subject.
Yeah, good. I thank you for the comment, and I thank you for your autobiography, which I was able to pick up in Madison. If anybody in the room hasn't checked it out, it's a pretty powerful story. Some really meaningful photographs, not only related to civil rights. There were a handful of those, and some pretty important and poignant stories, but just about life in general. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your work.
So what other photographs from Iowa did you look at, or do you have in the?
I have one other one. I didn't put it in my talk, and Mary could probably talk about it even more accurately than me right now, but I want to find it, and I'll read it to you. It's a young man at a 1955 tour of a farm with a Russian delegation, coming here to talk about the bountiful fields and farming and whatnot. And he takes it, because there's a lot of press there, as an opportunity to make a statement about conditions for African Americans. And he says, Iowans are prejudiced, narrow, and hypocritical to Negro workers. So the way that I thought about that photograph and the story that it helped communicate is we projected an image abroad that we were the greatest democracy in the world, yet we weren't necessarily able to take care and extend our ideals to every citizen in the country. And he was using that opportunity with the Russians here to attract the attention of the press. Whether or not it was successful, who knows? But that was a great tactic. I have another photo in the book of a Brooklyn sidewalk in an incredibly rundown part of Brooklyn. And Bob Edelman, who shot many photographs north and south, captured it. And when Look magazine published it, and the editor went to Russia for something, somebody stole the magazine out of his bag and published that photograph in a Russian language newspaper, the Pravda. And I thought, you know, I don't believe that story. And Bob Edelman told me about it in an interview. And sure enough, I got access to Pravda through the University of Wisconsin digitized newspapers and did any number of word combinations to try to get it, and I found it. They did reprint it. I couldn't read anything, but it was the photograph. So, I mean, that was done time and time again.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, we do. Excellent.
In your research, is there anything that you felt you didn't have access to or could not reach or find?
It's a big question because there's so many photographers. One of the ones that I wanted to use was Moneta Sleep Jr. He won the Pulitzer Prize for a photograph of Dr. King's funeral, of his wife and the daughter, you know, there. And that was the first Pulitzer Prize for an African-American photographer. And I wasn't able to use any of his photographs. I didn't find any that fit. Permissions probably and price might have been an issue. And there were other really well-known photographers that I couldn't use for whatever reason. And there were certainly archives that I couldn't travel to for research budget reasons and just my daily life, my job and my family to get away to do that. And then there were also archives like the Milwaukee Police Department. They would not let me, over the period of about the last 7 years, just go and look at them. And I'll go back a couple slides because I used a quote on the far right, and it just says, photographs were taken throughout the demonstration by a member of the Bureau of Identification. The following persons known to us took part in the demonstration. And the footnote there reads, it was a Milwaukee Police Department memo that somebody had gotten through a Freedom of Information Act like 2 decades earlier. And it listed out the people who were there, the license plates of their cars, what time they left, such as that. We took this number of photographs. So the photographs in the archives exist, but the relationships are so badly tarnished and negative in a lot of communities that there's such a lack of trust that there's virtually no way you're going to get to see those photographs. And a lot of people have said, well, why didn't you do a Freedom of Information Act? And there's a lot of value to that, but for publishing a photography book, they'll photocopy things, but I would never see the prints. And even if I found out they had the photos, I mean, I couldn't use them, so I kind of just left it.
Did your work on this project inform your American Girl work on the Melody doll, and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started my research on civil rights era before we did anything at American Girl. So I started it back in 2007-ish. And I learned a lot about the civil rights movement outside of the South early on for this, and that made a big impact on where we went with the project at American Girl. For those of you who don't keep up on what's going on in the doll business, we recently released a 1963 doll and 6-book series set in Detroit, so in Motown, where you've got the great music, but also the strong NAACP branch and the strong black community there and the civil rights movement. Dr. King came there in June '63, 2 months before the March on Washington, and they had 125,000 people in a march, the biggest civil rights demonstration up to that point. And it was eclipsed by the March on Washington. That's why we don't know anything about it. But it was a really hopeful and interesting moment in the civil rights movement, and we thought, why not look at the North? Because what, Southern community were we going to choose? And we had many connections to the South in the books. So I like to make sure that there's not overlap with the two, but I think that my research on this and my early grad school work helped make that quicker. I knew who to recruit for advisory panels. We had Julian Bond on our advisory panel for that project. He passed away recently, so he didn't get to see the release of it. And we had a number of scholars on Detroit and people who marched with Dr. King in Detroit or grew up there. So.
One more question?
Sure.
Of the photographers that you were able to make contact with, did they discuss the feelings, any attitudes that were expressed at the time in terms of their concerns or body safety?
Yeah. That's a great question. There was, it ran the gamut. There were, I'm trying to think back to some of the Milwaukee stories. There was a team of photographers. One held a movie camera and one held a still camera and a photographic camera. And one was white and one was black. And when they were in the wrong neighborhood, they would switch. The one would take the most expensive camera. There's a story from the black press in Milwaukee where the guy took the image and he just knew it was the shot, and he would also talk about how eerie it felt to be in that crowd, to be in the scary situations where people were throwing things or taunting or there was tear gas. 45 years later, they could describe it in detail, that it made that much of an impression on them. So.
Now I have another question.
Sure.
I said that was the last one. So the photographers were both black and white. Is that pretty much true? So for the black press, were they all black for the most part?
I don't know across the board, but probably overwhelmingly black, yeah. The ones that I worked with, all were African American for the black press. There were great, there were just great interviews. There were interviews that were done in the late 60s that are out at Howard. They sent researchers and oral historians to Milwaukee in 1967, 1968. And there's probably at least 5 to 6 interviews that are out in Howard. And I was able to, track them down that they existed, get the transcripts, sometimes get tapes to listen to. So those were so much more powerful, as you can imagine, within months of it happening, their reactions, and compared to me interviewing them, some of them, which I've done now, about 5 years ago. There was a photographer and a newspaper editor from the black press that were interviewed. And so they talked about how, they were illustrating these issues for the black newspaper, but most blacks already understood what was going on. Their photographs were making it more visible, but it was well understood. So it was often the white press, the mainstream media, when those photographs showed up in the mainstream media, they made a difference. And in Milwaukee, that was the case too. The last bit I'll say about Milwaukee before I say another thing is the Milwaukee mainstream press, when it blew up, they showed about 50 to 60% of the photographs were the police, rioting whites, tear gas, and politicians. And about 15% were the black protesters. So the people who marched into the streets to change the housing segregation issue, were able to call attention to the issue, but they couldn't control the message. So they were able to get it onto the newspaper, but they were rarely focused on. So that was an interesting angle or perspective on it. Now in the black press, it was quite different. You know, they were overwhelmingly covering what the local people were doing. They were showing inside the churches where the marches were starting with rallies. They were showing people making sandwiches, helping feed the volunteers. They were showing huge rallies with thousands of people in the back of the church, in the parking lot. It was a much more community, and they were looking at the ordinary citizens in Milwaukee rather than the elected officials and the police and the chaos. So if you didn't feel like asking questions tonight, because this is on Iowa, you know, being recorded and going online, my email's on there in the middle. You know, jot it down, send me some questions. I would love to hear from you. I had a wonderful guy in Madison send me a picture the day after. He didn't introduce himself, he didn't come up, but he sent me a picture he took of Dr. King in '62. That was really powerful. And then I told him, you know, where I was going, and I was going to be at Left Bank Books in St. Louis. And he said, "You'll never believe it, my brother helped co-found that cooperative in 1969, and sure enough, he's still associated with it." And the other thing you're not going to believe is that SNCC poster you showed with John Lewis, he had that on his wall all during college. So I saw that growing up. So I know that there are little stories that you'll think of later and might want to share, or questions or observations. So please feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you very much.